Welcome to Speaking to Speakers, the podcast that brings together business leaders, coaches, keynote presenters, actors, voiceover talent, and anyone else who uses words and their voice to make their living. I'm Robert Mattson. Let's hear what they have to say. Welcome to Speaking to Speakers. Today, we're very fortunate to have Valerie Gordon. Valerie is the founder and president of CommanderinShe, and also has a great history. Valerie, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me today.
Valerie, let's start out with a really impactful question. What is the number one most important aspect of storytelling that some storytellers forget?
Well, I'm glad you're starting there, because if anyone is listening to this and wondering, well, what am I going to get out of it? That is the most important part of sharing a story. It's the audience. It's the connection with the audience and meeting their needs. And I say that's the number one thing that storytellers forget, because we often get so wrapped up in our own story and we're so excited to share it, and we're forgetting about the person who's receiving it. So for all your listeners today, I know we're going to share a number of tips about what makes a story meaningful and memorable, and how to use storytelling in a variety of ways to impact your personal career, your presentations, really meeting them wherever they are. So listeners, that's what you're going to get out of it today. We're going to meet the audience's needs where they are.
It's so great when I have a guest on and we're exactly on the same page. One thing I start when I teach classes or work with people, I tell them audiences are selfish. They're not there because they like you, unless of course you have friends in the audience, but they want something out of it. And what do they, and so you have to cater to their needs. And also one thing, I have a big poster sitting, you can't see it, but I have a big poster here on the right-hand side. And it says, it's not what you're saying, it's what they're hearing.
Absolutely. I saw a great quote the other day, and I don't know who it's attributed to, but it said, in effect, something like, effective communication is when you understand what I thought I said. And so somewhere between that intent of what you're saying and the interpretation, there's this void, there's this gap that we're trying to close. And people use storytelling because stories are a great connector. And that's my background, is in storytelling, putting stories actually on television. But throughout my career, I learned a lot about the impact and influence of a story and how and why we can use them. And you mentioned that audiences are selfish. I actually think storytellers can be a little selfish. We have a story, we want to share it, and we have to tell it in a way that's going to get people not only to listen to it, but to hear us. What is the communication we're trying to get across? So the number one rule of storytelling for me is start with the goal. Start with the goal of the story and how it relates to your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could probably talk for the full podcast on that topic alone. But you mentioned something. You said, in my career, and you have a very interesting career. So what I'd love for you to share a little bit about your history. And I wish that the audience, it's a podcast, so they can't see, Valerie and I are on video chat as we talk. And I can see what's behind her, and you can't. So Valerie, tell us a little bit about not only your career, but also what's behind you right now.
So I'm in my home office, and there's a bookshelf behind me with photo albums and trinkets and pictures of my kids. And that must be what you're referring to, of course, isn't it?
Of course, because no one else says that.
But above those are some hardware from my career that, people seem to be really impressed by this. They're little gold statues. Yes, those are Emmy Awards. They are from the Sports Emmys, from a career working in sports television. And they line my office. And while I'm very proud of them, the story behind them really is, those were team projects. I think when people see them, they assume I was on some, red carpet gala and getting up in front of thousands of people and making my acceptance speeches. And I'm very proud of the work that I did. I worked with some really talented people putting stories on the air, and that's where those came from. But it's interesting because as a part of my story, on my bio, it is listed I'm a 10-time Emmy Award winner, and that is true. There are 10 of those behind me, along with a few other things. But to me, that's the least interesting thing about my story. I understand why it captures people's attention, but as you know, in any career, all that glitters is not gold. And I think they represent something to other people about success or the pinnacle. And while those were certainly highlights of my career and the grand story of my life, I don't actually think that those are what I will remember the most. But they do make a nice backdrop. So that's why they're back there. But
Right.
yes, I did spend 20 years in television. I worked for a number of networks. And my interest in television actually started with the Olympics, the Olympic Games. When I was a kid, I loved watching the Olympics. And I loved watching these up close and personal stories that ABC back in 1984 would put on the air about the athletes. You got to see a glimpse of their lives. And I didn't realize at the time that the goal of those stories was to connect the viewer to the content so that you would spend more time watching the competition, thereby raising the ratings, then they could charge higher advertising rates. I mean, that's the reason to tell a story in business is you're influencing consumer behavior. I just liked these stories and I thought they were really cool. And it kind of led me into a path of studying communications and working my way up in television production. I did work on 2 Olympic Games, 1996 Atlanta Olympics and 1998 Winter Games in Nagano, Japan. And I worked with some amazing storytellers on those athlete profiles. So that early love of seeing those stories on the air did lead to a career. And then I went on to become a producer for a number of highly regarded shows, including HBO's Real Sports with Brian Gumbel, and I worked for CBS News and ultimately for ESPN, overseeing feature content. And I worked, like I said, with a number of talented storytellers and on projects that garnered those awards behind me. And along the way, I learned a lot about what makes a story meaningful and memorable and how to connect with the audience. But I also saw ways that we could apply storytelling to our lives and to our careers. And I was particularly interested in the challenges women have in the corporate world and in the sports world with growing a career and the impact of stories on that career. Stories that people tell us about how we should act and how we get that next job, stories that we tell ourselves about the challenges of the corporate career. And of course, I've only ever been a woman in the workforce. And while storytelling and those career challenges are a universal theme, universal language for both genders, I decided ultimately to leave my media career, my television career, and found CommanderinShe, which of course is a play on Commander-in-Chief, and spend my time speaking to women's groups primarily, as well as to other audiences, about how to apply the principles of storytelling to our own lives for greater career success and satisfaction. And that's what I do now. I write and speak to audiences at conferences and work with corporations about just what does it mean to be a storyteller and how does the average person use storytelling in a way to influence and impact audiences of all sizes, whether you're giving a presentation or you're sitting down for your annual performance review. And I use my 20 years in television production and in putting stories on the air to come up with a variety of exercises of how do we take those principles of great storytellers and apply them to our own lives.
So that's a great point. And I don't want people to think just because it's Commander-in-Chief that you only talk to women. Obviously, that's something you do a lot, and that's fantastic because I think a lot of women need to be better represented in corporate America. Even today, we've made great strides, but there's still so many strides to go. But you work with everybody.
I do work with everybody. And while the name is Commander-in-She, I do say storytelling is a gender neutral language. And there is a Commander-in-He and Commander-in-She, Commander-in-We, Commander-in-Me, whatever you want to call it. But basically, I teach audiences how to take command of their own stories. And I mentioned I use the principles of storytelling. So an example would be, every story has to have these 3 main things. Character, your story needs to be about someone, and you are the central character of your own story. Plot, something needs to happen in your story. And as active authors of our own story, we can create plot points to make things happen. And narrative point of view, how the story is told. And when you think about that as your own story, that's the voice in your head, who's narrating your own story, your own thoughts and feelings. And if you have a faulty narrator, maybe an overthinking one or an unreliable one or an arrogant one, what's the impact of that on your relationships and how you present yourself? So we start there with some of those story elements, and then we get into things like conflict and dissatisfaction and envy and things that come up over the course of our careers, and how to think about our careers as a series of chapters and use some of those story elements to grow an even better next chapter. So I'm somewhat of a career coach and a communications advisor and a content creator around the idea of storytelling, what's going to happen in your ongoing story. And as a result of that, not only do I speak to audiences, I hear a lot of stories, and I try to decipher the meaning behind them and make sure that our messaging is clear, what we're putting out into the world. Again, effective communication is that the audience is hearing what we want them to hear.
Absolutely. It's funny. I'm doing a talk to a networking group on Wednesday, people that are searching for work, about storytelling in the job hunt. And the thing I talk about is that you have a natural 3-act arc of your story. You have to get through the recruiter, then you have to talk to the hiring manager, and then usually you have to talk to the people you're going to work with. And how do you have a major story arc that tells your story, but also you have different story arcs within that, because you have different audiences and different goals. So it's very interesting that you're talking about that. So you've had a pretty exciting life. You've done some very interesting things, traveling, Olympics, all over the world, Emmys, all that wonderful stuff. But a lot of people will sit in a room and they'll see a speaker, whether it's yourself or somebody else, and you're like, wow, they've had such a great life. My life is not that exciting. My life is so small. I haven't had these trips. I've never climbed Everest. I've never led a team to great success. I don't have a story to tell. What do you say to those people?
I think it's the smallest details that make our story unique. So I hear that a lot, and it's a common dilemma, right? You feel like, well, my story is just not all that interesting, or I haven't overcome some great tragedy, so what do I have to offer a room full of people? I see it a lot actually now with kids applying to college with the personal essay. You're telling your story, and everyone feels like they have to up the ante. Well, I've never survived cancer or been homeless, or what do I have to offer? But when you think about a story that's been memorable to you, it's not the big overarching themes that triumph over adversity. It's the small details in a story and the little plot twists. And when you think as well about the connection to the audience and what you want the audience to take away from your story, it's those small relatable connectors. So I tell a story, if I'm speaking, let's say, to a group of busy executives about work-life balance, which is a phrase I hate anyway, but work-life balance is a story we're telling ourselves about why we are or are not successful in our multifaceted, very busy lives. And if I tell a story about leaving my house one day in the chaos of the morning rush and feeling like I forgot something, and I don't figure out what that is until I pull out of the garage and head down the driveway and I hear a thunk, and then I realize with this deluge of brown liquid coming down my windshield that, oh, I forgot my coffee mug, my travel coffee mug. I left it on the top of my car as I was throwing my bag inside. Now, that's a small, inconsequential story, but amazingly relatable. When I tell that story and I ask the audience, if you've ever done that, raise your hand. By the way, more people than you would think have done that and done that more than once. Sure. But even if they haven't done it, they understand that feeling. They've done something similar. So while many of us can be inspired by people with huge stories, with gigantic plot twists and moving across country or overcoming illness or divorce or some other horrible circumstances, it's those small details that make our story unique. So my first suggestion to anyone who wants to tell a better story is don't forget about the small stuff. That's what makes your story unique.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great, I think it's a Japanese proverb, fall down 7 times, get up 8 times. And it's such a great proverb because little victories can mean so much. I've told the story many, many times that I recall from my youth, which was the Pinewood Derby, which anyone who's a parent who was either a Cub Scout or had a child who's a Cub Scout or had a nephew or a niece, well, nephew, hopefully nieces soon. I think nieces are allowed now, which is great.
I think so.
It's a situation where I talk about my brother and me, and we were both in the Pinewood Derby, and it became the climactic race, my brother against me for the pack championship. That's not very big. That's a story of an 8 and a 9-year-old. And it's still momentous because people relate to it. And I think you're absolutely right.
And the relatability is such a key factor. I mean, to me, the 3 main things that every story needs if you want to connect with your audience, you said that the first is that relatability, that they understand where you're coming from and can somehow relate it to their own experience. The second is authenticity. that we want to know that the person telling the story is authentic, that it's a true story. I'm sure you've heard speakers where you're just like, it's a great story, but I'm not really, I'm not really
buying
feeling
this one.
it. Yeah, not really buying it. Sometimes our stories, we're so worried about making them perfect that we gloss over them. And that's when you lose your audience, when they don't really believe you. They don't believe it's an authentic story. And that's why sharing stories with conflict or failure are so great. And the third one is generosity. That your story is generous, that you are not using your time telling the story, again, whether it's for an audience of one, the person you're interviewing with, or a room full of people, but that you're not telling your story for self-serving needs. You're doing it in a generous way because you're either imparting information or impacting with a feeling that's of value to the audience. So those are my three tenets: that relatability, authenticity, and generosity.
Yeah, those are fantastic. And I talk about intrigue. I always want to start with intrigue, and whether that is your big story arc or your little story arc, you need to have something interesting. And I'm dying to put an order for T-shirts that just say intrigue on it, just so people will ask, "What's that shirt about?" Well, it's what you just did. You were curious and you asked me a question. So
you should absolutely market that. I think that's, that the shirt itself is intriguing.
Well, thank you. I think, intrigue and passion is a big thing that I see. And I talk to people a lot. And I talk to a lot of salespeople. And sometimes I tell them, it doesn't have to be your story, as if you're telling a good story. You can borrow someone's story, or you have to find the inner truth, though, the connection to that, because there's a difference between selling and educating. And a lot of salespeople they want to sell. It's like, no, if you educate, if you say, I want to give you a gift of this knowledge, and you find an interesting way that captures the attention of the audience, and it can be self-serving education because you're obviously there for a reason, but give them something of value. Always give first and take second. And I think that's one of the big things that people have to change their mind a little bit, especially if you're dealing with salespeople telling those type of what I think of as goal-driven stories. And you and I could tell stories, and it was what Robert Cialdini's book about influence. It's Influence, the Power of Persuasion. And he talks about people are influenced by people they like. And how can you tell you like somebody? You tell them stories. And, we might share a whole bunch of stories because, we've met, we start to chat, and it's like, I'm going to give Valerie a call and we're going to chat, and we start going back and forth. And then there's the ones that's like, okay, I want to use it as an educational tool so people will connect with me and I can teach them what I need to teach them, whether in a sales environment or I think even in higher education. And I've got a 13-year-old son, and, teachers tell him stories and he learns from it. So I think it's something that people have to think about. Again, I think to the purpose is what you touched on earlier. And then apply those tools to that purpose.
Well, storytelling is such a big buzzword in business. It has been for a number of years now because of the ability to influence consumer behavior or bring stats and other boring data to life. We want to add stories to it. And I think you're absolutely right. Starting with that intrigue, first of all, or what storytellers, would consider that narrative hook. How are you going to grab your audience and make you want to listen to them? And there's nothing wrong with goal-driven stories, that the goal is, okay, I want people to buy my product, or I want people to, I want to educate them, I want to entertain them. It's perfectly good to start with that goal in mind and keep that goal in mind. But you had said it yourself when you were talking about giving something to the audience. It's that sense of generosity. Of that's why we're sharing the story. And what I would say as well is, you don't need to be a professional speaker or an educator or a salesman or anything like that to be a great storyteller. Everybody is a storyteller. I mean, stories are just, they're like these invisible things that fly around us. What you did yesterday is a story. Where you're going to take your next vacation, where you see your career in 2 years, that conversation you want to have with your boss about a raise. You've already told yourself a story about why you deserve it. So the whole idea of taking command of your stories is realizing the opportunity to find small details throughout your life that not only you can tell as a story, but that you can capitalize on to advance your story. One of the key things in my career, which again was I had a wonderful and exciting job, and I also hit a point of not being able to do it anymore. That I guess in a story format would be sort of that that conflict or that climax where I kind of burned out. I was exhausted all the time and had sort of lost the passion for what I was doing, working in a very 24/7 environment. I have 2 kids as well. And I really had to take a step back and say, okay, these are clues in my story. And maybe a lot of what I've done is now just becoming the past story. These are present clues, the sense of conflict or dissatisfaction. And how am I going to use that then to build the next chapter? And having gone through that experience and being able now to write the whole second half of a career, that's how I believe storytelling is a really valuable skill, not just for speakers on stage, but for us to think about our lives like an ongoing story. So for anyone who feels like they're waiting to see what happens next, or they're feeling like a bit player in someone else's plot, or maybe like you're reading the same chapter over and over again. I get up and I do the same stuff and I'm feeling stuck. The idea of turning the page starts with becoming a more active author of your story. And some of that, of course, is how you encapsulate your backstory. Who am I and what have I done and what do I want to do and what's going on presently, but also having a vision for this future story. And I believe very much that there's a better next chapter in each of us. So we're really talking about storytelling in 2 different ways. One is how to impact and influence by using storytelling, but we can't forget the fact that there's an impact and influence on the stories we tell ourselves, those inward stories, and how we can capitalize on those as well.
That's great. And you and I, before we jumped on the podcast, when we were chatting, and I was talking about the connection between audience and information. The story. There's the audience, and then there's you in between. And I talked about being a conduit between the truth of the story and the experience of the audience. And I've actually changed that a little bit. And I recently actually ordered on Amazon. I'm going to be doing a keynote in March, and I bought a 4-inch lens, basically a magnifying glass. And I bought that to illustrate a conduit doesn't direct you to the parts of the story. And I think the speaker has to be a little bit more active, and they have to, actually focus people on the parts of the truth that tell the great story. So talking about telling a great story, I've recently, by the way, I've got caught up in a YouTube channel, a couple of them called Cinema Sins and Cinema Wins. If you've never checked it out, it's really fun. A very intelligent person. His name is Lee Boucher or Boucher. It's hard to know. But he dissects films, and he'll do 15 to 20 minutes and go through the film and tell you all the wins and sins. So let's talk about the wins and sins of storytellers. So what are the wins that a storyteller should be leaning into or looking for or exemplifying?
Okay, great. So we started with, of course, the goal of the story. What are they hoping to accomplish, and how are they going to relate that to the audience? So for me, it's not so much about who you are and what you're talking about. It's why you are telling that particular story and how you're going to relate it to the audience. So we always start with the why and the how. I'm a big believer in the narrative hook. You have to get people interested in your story, but you can't just lodge into it if they're not sure where you're going with it. So a good example would be, I was following a gentleman who I don't want to name, but following a gentleman who believes in storytelling, but he's not a storyteller in his background. He just started including storytelling in his presentations, and he began a workshop, like an online workshop with, let me start with a story. In 1909, my great-grandfather was, living in Italy. And now at this point, I've already tuned him out. This might be the most fantastic story in the world, but I don't know why he's telling it and how it relates to me. So by starting with perhaps the goal of the story or, what we're going to get out of it, I'd be more willing to invest in it. So that was his first sin. The second sin was it went on too long. Best stories not only need to be clear in their intent, they do need to be concise. It is really okay to leave your audience wanting more or having questions. You don't need to answer every question they have with the story. It's almost like a teaser to what's to come. So clear and concise communication. I have this sort of 4C formula, and those would be 2 of the C's. And also that it's not only convincing, that authenticity in the story, I'm convinced by what you're telling me, but that it's conversational as well. Sometimes storytellers are too good. And when you're hearing from them, it sounds more like a performance artist. And we want to know that it's a real story. So those would be some of the sins. Some of the wins for me would be someone who's just engaging and someone who takes the story journey where there are plot twists and turns. To me, there's nothing better than surprise in a story with, oh, I didn't see that coming.
Sure. Yeah.
So, so taking people on the journey and the twists and turns before you get to the reveal at the end is traditional storyline, but it works particularly well in presentations. You want your audience to be on the edge of the seat, trying to figure out what happens, what's going to come next. And I know you have some tips as well. What would be some of your wins and sins?
Well, just riffing off your example, the thing that I immediately dislike is the gentleman saying, I'd like to tell you a story. Don't read me the stage directions. Walk me into the world. If that person started in 1909, my grandfather did something interesting, and you could feel the connection of wanting to share your grandfather's story. To me, that creates a little bit of intrigue, and there's that balance there. You want to buy in why am you telling the story, but you also want to create that intrigue. So I think that's one of the tough things that you have to deal with. Another thing is people have to realize the tools they have available, and PowerPoint is unfortunately one of them, and it has its use. And it can be a very powerful tool and very effective. But I want to see them use their body, their voice, their pausing. One thing I show a lot of people is the first 120 seconds of the I Have a Dream speech in waveform. So you can see how MLK actually used pauses to emphasize certain aspects of it. He used repetition, and he actually used repetition a number of times, not just the I Have a Dream, but he used it a number of times in his talk to reinforce certain elements of his talk. But I want to see physical space be used. And even if you are just simply turning your body one direction or another, if you don't have a lot of space, but you're showing me the positive and the negative by turning right and left, show me something, give me more of the story. And finally, gestures are important because people, especially business people, or even performers, actors, young actors, I don't know what to do with my hands. It's something that you hear all the time. And people end up with Velcro elbows where they're stuck to their sides and they're using these tiny little gestures. And they have to realize that gestures are not an addition to language. They are a part of language. And if you think of American Sign Language, there is what I usually refer to as business sign language, where you can use your gesture set and spread it out and widen it to give more information to the listener and show what the story is. I happen to have an issue. I have a medical issue where occasionally I will lose part of the hearing in one ear, and I have episodes. And eventually that's going to happen where they tell me I'm going to go deaf in one ear. So if I watch the gestures to get more of the story when I'm having an episode where I can't get as much hearing information. And if you're in a room that's a bowling alley and you've got people in the back, you've got to give them more information physically than verbal information so they can pick up more things. So I think that is one of the big sins and wins if they do it well or they don't do it well.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting story. I mean, I hope that's something you'll share as well about that challenge of if you can't fully hear it or occasionally or don't know when the hearing might go out and the feedback that you're getting from the audience. That's a great story, and I hope you'll share that as part of yours. I was curious, when you do that keynote, do you use a PowerPoint?
I use PowerPoint for certain things. There are different types of PowerPoints. Some are Zen slides. They're basically a big backdrop. And if you've got a big projection behind you, it's just like being on stage in the theater. You can change your backdrop and showcase certain elements of it. And sometimes you want to have information that you can put up on a slide because it's less for you and more for people to be able to read and visually lock onto a word. But I tell people the key to a good PowerPoint slide is it's seen and ignored.
Yes.
It's registered, and then you go back to the speaker, because if they're reading that, they're not paying attention to you.
Right, absolutely. I like the idea that you incorporate images with it because the images are part of the story then. It's part of an experience.
Absolutely. And
information.
Yeah, and multimedia, a multimedia experience of some kind. You can use video, you can use sound. Actually, it's odd that you're going to say it, is that I'm actually writing a keynote speech on the challenges of what I have is called Meniere's disease. It also has vertigo tied into it, which is just a boatload of fun. And you don't have to go to Six Flags or Disney. You can get vertigo right there in your own home. But it's a situation where how it affects you, and people think when you lose hearing, you just decrease the information. No, you actually get bad information, and it mixes with the good information, and you become less effective. and that affects you socially. It affects you intellectually. There's a lot of issues with it.
Well, just listening to you, and you're using one of my favorite story devices as you're relaying that very personal and impactful story to me, is humor. That you're able to present it in a way that, despite the challenges of this, you relate it to your audiences as with a bit of humor. And I think that that's a tool in storytelling that I think is really important. You can have a terrifically dramatic story, but that's my takeaway just from, I completely relate to what you're telling me, even though I haven't had that disease, but I can imagine how challenging it is. And also, you've given me sort of that visual imagery of, you don't need to go to Six Flags or an amusement park to feel this way. Now I kind of know. I have that feeling just on how you relayed that story to me. So while I'm sorry to know that that's something that you suffer from, I think just the way you've told that story, it becomes part of your arsenal to relate to the audience.
In my experience, there are different types of speakers, people who come at the speaking challenge in different ways. What's your experience?
Well, my experience has been influenced now that I have a speaking career, which again was not my original, and I didn't set out to be a speaker. I found a problem in the business world and wanted to use my experience to be able to address it. So it was how I tied my background in storytelling to tell stories to impact people. And I have found taking on any number of speaking engagements, I do think there's a difference. I think while it relies on the same tips and tools and techniques, I know for me, when I'm speaking, let's say in front of a classroom, it's a little bit different than speaking at a conference. A keynote is different from a workshop. The pacing and the audience engagement, those are different. And one other thing I've taken up recently is performance speaking. Mm-hmm. If you follow groups like The Moth or other groups like that, yeah. I've had the opportunity to share a story with some local groups here in Hartford where I live. Speak Up and Tell Me Another are two of the local groups here. And what's amazing to me, I wouldn't think that it would be different. You're sharing a story. I get exceptionally nervous for those performances. And when I'm in front of a group, when I'm doing a workshop or teaching in front of a classroom or even doing a keynote, I actually am not nervous. There's something about sharing my past experience there that is different for me than the performance speaking.
Let me ask you a question. Yeah. I'm going to interrupt you. Is it because of the expectations of the audience, or is it because of the personal aspect of the story? What might it be?
I think that's such a great question. I think it's just because it's something new. It's a little bit different and it's new for me. You know that you are there for entertainment value. The audience is looking to be entertained. They still want the great takeaway of the story, but the goal there is a little bit different. You're not generous in that you're giving them tips and tools and techniques they can use and put into their own lives. You are there maybe for entertainment value. I've also considered whether it's just because it's considered performance speaking that creates some sort of performance anxiety. But I found it very interesting because I did one just this past weekend, and when I walked off the stage, even though people hadn't known this, I felt my hand shaking.
Was that the one about the lentils?
Yes, I did. It wasn't about lentils. It was a story about the theme of the show was close encounters, and I was sharing a story about the first time I went to a yoga retreat.
Yes.
And I was really out of my element. And the goal of the story really, of course, was to entertain the audience. And I do think I met that objective, but I was surprised by how nervous I was. So I do think that while some of the goals of storytelling might stay the same, I do think they differ. I don't know if you found that in your own experience as well.
One of the things that a lot of people don't do enough is practice. Mm-hmm. And if they practice, and I've heard this way too many times, it's like, well, have you gone through it? Yeah, I went through it in my car. Or I went through it looking into a mirror. Really? Are you going to be presenting it in a mirror or in your car? Well, no, but maybe you want to do it in a room. Maybe you want to do it in a room where you can walk just like you're going to walk in the room where you're going to be. Being comfortable in the space is vitally important to any performer. As my background is in stage work. And if you are rehearsing in a rehearsal hall and then move to the stage, it's a whole different ball of wax because things change. And then you add another factor. That's why you'll see if a prop falls, well, it throws you off because that's not what you've rehearsed to. So having that kind of rehearsal and even practicing when things go wrong, asking if you're in a business setting, when are they going to ask me a question? Can I work around that question? To me, it's that, and I'll ask you a question here. If you did that same talk again, would you be less nervous?
I think it depends again on the venue. There's something about the audience sitting and waiting to be entertained. I think I would be better at it. Obviously, the more you do something, the better you get at it. I do still think I'd be nervous, and I don't think nerves are a bad thing.
No, not at all.
But it was interesting to me how different I felt in that environment. I do think practice is important. I think the ability to know that things won't always go according to plan. And by the way, that becomes part of your story. Sure. I mean, the best storytellers to me, that's the great thing about thinking about our entire lives as an ongoing developing story is if you get up on stage to give a presentation and you're going to tell a story as part of it and it bombs, well, what a great story for the next time you have to tell a story about that time you tried to tell a story and it didn't work. These are all just experiences. Our stories are just experiences that we can capitalize on. But for someone who does now speak in front of audiences of all sizes for a living, I do still get nervous, and I think that that's a good takeaway for anyone to know you're not doing it wrong if you feel that way, as long as you can harness that adrenaline and use it to your advantage.
Yeah, nervousness is fine. Fear can be debilitating. But I think you're right. And the minute you were talking about that, I was like, yeah, life is improv, and things are going to change. Now, when I talk to people, I find that people fall into certain types of speakers. I'm not saying everyone's the same, but there are certain general cases that you see. And I see people that are, they're contrarians. They always want to come at it from, I'm going to teach you something that you don't know and you're wrong. They're futurists, people that are telling you this is going to happen and this is my grand vision. I've seen researchers, the people that I have every bit of data, and I'm going to share that data with you. I've got experts I work with. I am right. I know this really well. I've been doing this for 30 years. And I'm the expert. I see comedians. I see the passionate speakers. They're going to overwhelm you with passion. I see inspirational speakers that, Robin Benincasa, someone I use as an example, who's an adventure racer, which means they dump you into one really horrible spot and you and your team have to get to another really horrible spot, going through a bunch of horrible spots, usually involving leeches and mosquitoes. But when she's done talking, you're looking at yourself going, I couldn't get that spreadsheet done? What? And it's one of those situations. And there are confessors. There are Sherpas. There are all these different types of people that take different aspects. I love Sherpas. All they're about is getting you to where you need to go.
Interesting. Now, do you find people who can mix all of those different genres?
There are some people. You'll see ones that fit together more naturally. Research experts are someone that are a lot. Sherpa teachers. You see those a lot. Expert contrarians, a lot of those around there. But you never see, well, no, I don't say never. You never say never. But you seldom see like an expert Sherpa contrarian. Because the Sherpa is so wanting to get you where you go, and the contrarian is like wanting to prove you wrong.
Oh, interesting.
So there are mixes, but there's some tendencies that don't really blend well together.
And I'm also curious what the audience impact is of these different styles, or does it depend on the audience? Are there different styles of audience? They want to have an expert come talk to them. They want to have a Sherpa lead them. They want to be inspired by the passionate person.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's really the combination between the speaker and the audience, because we've touched on this a bunch of times. It's about the relationship.
Yep.
And it's about trust. Do I trust this person to give me something, to teach me something, to entertain me? And if you have someone who's a great comedic speaker and the person in the audience just does not want to be entertained, I'm not going to laugh. I'm sitting with my arms crossed and crappy body language, and I'm telling you I have no interest in being here. That is the validity of the relationship that you're going to form. And sometimes and many skilled speakers can swap. So I'm going to say an arrogant thing. I can probably swap between a lot of these different approaches because I've studied them so much. And my natural is I am a comedian teacher Sherpa. That is my approach, and that's what I go to. Have I used a contrarian approach? Sure. I've used it before. I love walking people down one path and having them say, yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. And me saying, no, that's absolutely wrong.
Yeah. As you were describing those to me, I think I might be a comedian teacher Sherpa too, which might be why I'm relating so well to you on this. I think that is my style. I've never really given it thought to it that way, but it's great to categorize them and kind of think about not only what do I do well, but what are the tools I can learn from some of these other styles. And by the way, before I forget, I also just want to say, if you're going to do a t-shirt with intrigue on it, you should also do another one that says life is improv. I thought that was great.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And so one thing, I was teaching a class just last week, and you can tell, there are two ways you can tell that people get it, is when they use the skills or when they can identify them. And I had a gentleman sitting in the back of the bowling alley because we had a very long, thin room. And he said, oh, hey, we asked for feedback from a speaker. He goes, you did this. And like, you got it. You now can see how people are using the skills. And the minute you can see them, you can steal them. And that's one of the really important things. But I mean, this has been a fantastic talk. And Valerie, I think I'm gonna put this out there now. And this is me showing my vulnerability. I think there's just much more that we can talk about. And I hope you would come back and maybe do another segment on the show. I would
love to dissect storytelling a little bit more, and I think we can give more tips to helping people find their signature story and improving their storytelling skill. But this was great, and I will leave that out there with the intrigue as to when we might be able to do it again. But thank you for having me. I love to talk to fellow storytellers and to hear your tips along the way. I think we have a lot in common, but I also learned a lot as well. So if you consider me your audience, then thank you for providing me with the information along the way.
But now some people aren't going to want to wait to hear more from you. So can you tell the listeners, if they want to get in contact with you, if they want to learn more about what you do in Commander-in-She, how could they find that information?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that opportunity. So I'm at CommanderinShe.com, commander-in-she.com, and I blog there regularly. So you can sign up for my newsletter on my site, read my blog. I have a Facebook page, Commander-in-She. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Commander-in-She, no hyphens. And I do a lot on LinkedIn as well, where you can find me as Valerie J. Gordon. So anyone who's interested in learning how to use storytelling for greater impact and influence and to take command of their career story through the principles of storytelling, I hope you'll track me down at Commander-in-She. Women and men, welcome. And thank you again for having me today.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait till we get a chance to talk again. That has been Valerie Gordon from Commander-in-She. She is a woman with a very diverse background in storytelling and is helping others find their own stories and how to tell it well. Thanks so much, and we can't wait to talk to you at the next podcast. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Speaking to Speakers is sponsored by ITM Speakers, helping executives, sales staff, and subject matter experts become more effective and persuasive communicators. Learn more at itmspeakers.com.